She walked into the wrong room, and there, in a photograph on display, was the mother who vanished 30 years ago.
Karen Ellison had attended exactly 4 funerals in her life before the one that changed everything, and none of them had prepared her for what waited inside Parlor B at Whitmore Family Funeral Home on a gray Tuesday afternoon in March. She had come to pay respects to a co-worker's uncle, a man she had met twice and barely remembered, because her office had sent a card and she felt it was the decent thing to show her face. The directory in the lobby listed 2 services running that day, Parlor A and Parlor B, and Karen, distracted and running late after circling the parking lot twice, walked through the wrong set of doors without checking the name on the placard beside them. She would replay that small, meaningless mistake for the rest of her life, because it was the hinge on which everything else turned. The room was quiet the way funeral homes are always quiet, hushed and carpeted and smelling faintly of lilies, with perhaps 20 people scattered among the folding chairs, none of whom Karen recognized. She told herself she had simply arrived early, before her co-worker's family, and took a seat near the back to wait. It was only when she looked up toward the front of the room, toward the open casket flanked by white flowers and a framed photograph on an easel beside it, that her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs and refused to move. The woman in the photograph was older than Karen remembered her, silver-haired, lined around the eyes, but the face underneath those changes was unmistakable. It was her mother's face. The exact tilt of the chin, the exact shape of the mouth, the small crescent scar above the left eyebrow that Karen had asked about 100 times as a child and never gotten a straight answer to. Karen's mother, Diane Ellison, had vanished when Karen was 9 years old, walking out of their house in Dayton, Ohio one October morning and never coming home, leaving behind no note, no trace, and no explanation that anyone in the family ever accepted. For 30 years, Karen had lived inside that absence, first as a confused child who thought she must have done something wrong, then as a teenager who built a hard shell around the subject and refused to discuss it, then as an adult who told herself she had made peace with not knowing. Her father, Robert, had never remarried and never spoke of Diane again after the second year, and the silence in that house had become its own kind of language, one Karen had learned fluently without ever choosing to. So when she looked up at a stranger's casket and saw her mother's face staring back at her from a photograph, something in her that had been quiet for 3 decades came awake all at once. She sat rigid in her folding chair for several long minutes, aware of her own pulse in a way she rarely was, running through every rational explanation her mind could produce. People have doubles, she told herself. Grief plays tricks on memory, and 30 years is long enough for a face half-remembered to bend itself into whatever shape a person's mind is desperate to see. But rational explanations have a way of losing their grip when the evidence sits 20 feet away under funeral lighting, and no matter how many times Karen tried to talk herself out of what she was seeing, the scar above that eyebrow refused to become anything other than exactly what it was. She did not make a scene. Whatever was happening, some instinct told her this was not the place to unravel. So she sat through the remainder of the service with her hands folded in her lap and her mind racing in 100 directions at once, watching the mourners file past the casket, listening to a pastor she didn't know speak about a woman named Eleanor Marsh who had lived a quiet, private life and would be deeply missed by those who knew her. The name meant nothing to Karen. It was not her mother's name, not any name she had ever heard associated with her family. And yet the face in that casket, when she finally worked up the nerve to walk past it herself, left no room for doubt. Karen stood over the body of a woman who had died a stranger to the world and stared down at features she had spent 30 years trying to remember correctly, afraid that time was slowly erasing them from her memory. She noticed other small things standing there that she would only make sense of later. The woman's hands, folded neatly over her chest, still carried the faint calluses of someone who had sewn for a living. A thin gold chain around her neck held no pendant, as though whatever had once hung there had been removed or lost long before this final day. Karen lingered a moment too long, long enough that an older woman 2 seats down leaned over and asked, gently, whether she had known Eleanor well. Karen said only that she thought she might have known someone who resembled her once, a lifetime ago, and the woman nodded politely, the way strangers do when they sense a conversation they are not meant to fully understand, and let the moment pass without pressing further. The pastor's eulogy offered Karen almost nothing to work with, a handful of generic kindnesses about a woman who kept to herself, who was dependable at her work, who never missed an opportunity to help a neighbor in need, but rarely accepted help in return. It was the eulogy of someone who had been known only from a careful distance, admired but never truly understood, and Karen found herself gripping the edge of her chair as she listened, aching to stand up and ask the room outright who this woman had really been before she was Eleanor Marsh. She didn't. She sat through the closing prayer, watched the casket close, and filed out with the rest of the mourners in silence. Karen left the funeral home that afternoon without speaking to anyone else, without asking a single further question, because she was terrified that if she said the wrong thing or asked in the wrong way, whatever thin thread had brought her to that room would snap before she understood what it meant. She sat in her car in the parking lot for nearly an hour before she trusted herself to drive, replaying the service second by second, trying to convince herself she had imagined the resemblance, and failing every time she reached the memory of that scar catching the light above the casket. If you have ever carried a question for decades that nobody in your family would answer, you already understand the particular ache Karen felt sitting in that parking lot, unable to drive, unable to fully believe what her own eyes had just shown her. And if this story pulls at something familiar in you, I'd ask you to subscribe to the channel before we go further, because what Karen uncovered over the following weeks is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends. That night, Karen pulled every box of old photographs down from her closet, spreading them across her kitchen table until the surface disappeared under 3 decades of family history. She found what she was looking for in a photograph from 1993, her mother standing in the backyard of their old house, laughing at something out of frame, the crescent scar above her eyebrow catching the afternoon light exactly the way it had in the framed photo at the funeral home. Karen held the 2 images side by side under her kitchen lamp until her eyes ached, and there was no reasonable interpretation left to reach for. The bone structure, the scar, even a small habit of tilting her head slightly to the left in photographs. All of it matched a woman who had supposedly died decades after Diane Ellison walked out of a house in Dayton and disappeared from the face of the earth. She went further than the photographs that night, pulling out an old shoebox of letters and school records she hadn't opened in years, searching for anything that might explain what she had seen. She found a birthday card her mother had written her only weeks before disappearing, the handwriting looping and slightly slanted in a way Karen suddenly realized she could still recognize instantly, the same hand that had signed the guest book at the funeral home, a signature Karen hadn't thought to examine closely until that very moment lying in her memory. She lay awake most of the night turning the coincidence over, unable to decide whether she was chasing a ghost or finally catching up to a truth that had been waiting patiently for 30 years. Unable to sleep, Karen opened her laptop near 2 in the morning and searched the name Eleanor Marsh alongside the town listed in the memorial program, finding almost nothing beyond a brief, generic obituary posted by the funeral home itself, 3 sentences long, offering no history before the last 3 decades. She tried searching for any public record tied to the name, any property listing, any old newspaper mention, and came up against a wall of silence so complete it felt deliberate. A person who had lived 30 years in one place should have left some digital trace by now, however small, and the almost total absence of one only deepened Karen's certainty that whoever Eleanor Marsh had been, she had worked hard to remain invisible. Her daughter, Megan, found her at the table past midnight and asked what was wrong, and Karen made the mistake of telling her the truth, which was that she believed she had just seen her missing grandmother lying in a casket under a stranger's name. Megan's reaction was gentle but unmistakably doubtful, the kind of careful tone people use when they think someone they love might be slipping into something unhealthy, and she suggested, as kindly as she could, that grief and old wounds have a way of making people see what they need to see rather than what is actually there. Karen understood why her daughter reacted that way. She had spent years telling herself the same thing whenever her mind wandered back to Diane, that the human brain is desperate for resolution and will manufacture patterns out of nothing to get it. But this was not a photograph in a crowd or a stranger's voice on the street. This was a scar in the exact same place, on a face that had aged exactly the way her mother's would have aged. The two of them argued quietly at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Megan worried her mother was chasing a fantasy built from decades of unresolved grief, Karen insisting she was not imagining a resemblance, but recognizing a fact. It was not the last time they would disagree over the course of the following weeks, but it was the first crack in what would eventually become Megan's own reluctant, careful willingness to help her mother dig further, even as she continued to brace herself for the likely disappointment of a dead end. Karen called the funeral home the next morning under the thin pretense of having missed the service and wanting to send a card to the family, and the woman who answered, after some hesitation, gave her the name of the attorney handling Eleanor Marsh's estate, explaining that there did not appear to be any next of kin the funeral home had been able to locate. That detail alone struck Karen as strange. A woman who had lived quietly enough to have no family reachable at her death, yet who had clearly lived somewhere, worked somewhere, built some kind of life for 30 years. Karen reached the attorney, a measured man named Gregory Paulson, who was cautious on the phone but agreed, after Karen explained her suspicion as calmly as she could manage, to meet with her in person the following week. He warned her, gently, not to expect much. Eleanor Marsh's file, he said, was thinner than any estate file he had handled in 20 years of practice. The week between that phone call and the meeting stretched painfully for Karen. She caught herself rehearsing questions in the shower, in the car, at her desk during meetings she barely followed, trying to prepare for every possible answer Paulson might give her, from the mundane to the devastating. She told her father nothing during that week, unwilling to reopen his old wound with nothing but a suspicion to offer him, and she asked Megan not to mention it either, not until there was something solid enough to stand on. The waiting was its own kind of torment, the closest Karen had come in 30 years to feeling the same helpless uncertainty she remembered from childhood, when every knock at the door might have been news about her mother and never was. During that same week, on Megan's insistence, Karen agreed to order an at-home DNA testing kit, reasoning that if there truly was a connection, science would eventually offer proof no memory or photograph ever could. The funeral home, when Karen called again, was reluctant at first to discuss anything related to remains, but eventually connected her with the county coroner's office, which confirmed that testing had already been completed as a routine part of processing an unidentified estate, and that results, if requested through the proper channels by a verified relative, could be released. Karen submitted her own sample the following day and was told the comparison would take several weeks, an agonizing stretch of uncertainty that would run alongside everything else she was about to learn from Paulson. The meeting with Paulson took place in a small office above a hardware store in a town 2 states away from Dayton, a town called Millbrook that Karen had never once visited or heard mentioned by anyone in her family. Paulson laid out what little he knew. Eleanor Marsh had arrived in Millbrook 30 years earlier with almost no documented history before that date, renting a small house with cash, working as a seamstress and later a bookkeeper for a local hardware supplier, paying for everything in cash whenever possible, and keeping such a narrow circle of acquaintances that even her closest neighbor of 2 decades knew almost nothing personal about her. She had never married, never had listed children, never applied for a passport or a loan that would have required deeper documentation. She had, in Paulson's careful legal phrasing, lived like someone who did not want to be found. Paulson mentioned, almost as an aside, that Eleanor had once hired him to draw up a sealed letter years earlier, to be opened only in the event of her death, and only by someone who could prove a specific familial connection, though she had never named that person directly. She had simply described her, Paulson said, checking his notes. A daughter, born in Ohio, with a small scar on her left knee from a bicycle accident at age 7. Karen's hand went instinctively to her own knee, to the faint white mark she had carried her entire adult life and never once thought to mention to a soul. In that moment, sitting across from a stranger in a cramped office above a hardware store, Karen understood with total certainty that Eleanor Marsh and Diane Ellison were the same woman, and that her mother had spent 30 years waiting for a day she must have known, somewhere in her heart, might never come. Paulson watched Karen carefully as the realization settled over her, and after a long silence he admitted something he said he had never told anyone connected to an estate before. Eleanor had come to his office once a year, every year for nearly a decade, simply to confirm that the letter was still sealed and still safe, never asking him to change a single word of it, never explaining why the ritual mattered so much to her. He said he had always assumed there was a story behind it, but that it was not his place to ask, and that watching Karen sit across from him now, he finally understood what that story had been. He also mentioned, more hesitantly, that Eleanor had once asked him whether a person could legally reappear in someone's life after being presumed dead by their own choice, a strange, abstract question she had framed as a purely hypothetical legal matter. Paulson said he had given her the honest, complicated answer any attorney would, that it was legally possible but practically fraught, likely to raise as many questions as it resolved, and that Eleanor had simply nodded, thanked him, and never brought it up again. He had thought little of the exchange at the time. Now, he told Karen, it read like a woman quietly testing whether the door she had closed 30 years earlier might still, somehow, be opened. Paulson retrieved the sealed letter from a locked drawer and, after Karen provided identification and answered several more careful questions to satisfy his professional obligation, allowed her to take it home unopened, as Eleanor had instructed. Karen did not open it in the car, or in the parking lot, or even that evening. She waited until Megan was asleep and the house was silent, sat at the same kitchen table where she had first laid the photographs side by side, and finally broke the seal on an envelope that had been waiting for her for years longer than she had known to look for it. Inside was a letter in her mother's handwriting, the same looping, slightly slanted script Karen remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards 3 decades gone, and reading it felt like hearing her mother's voice again for the first time since childhood. The letter did not begin with an apology, though one would come later. It began instead with an explanation, one Karen had never imagined and could not have guessed it even in her wildest theorizing. Diane wrote that in the months before she disappeared, she had discovered something about her husband's business partner, a man involved in laundering money through a used car dealership on the edge of Dayton, and that when she confronted the situation and made clear she intended to go to the authorities, she was warned, in terms that left no ambiguity, that her family would suffer for it if she did not stay silent and disappear from their lives entirely. She wrote that she had spent weeks trying to find another way, a way to protect Karen and Robert without vanishing, and had found none that felt safe enough to risk her daughter's life on. Diane described the man by his first name only, Victor, careful even after 30 years, and even in a letter meant only for her daughter's eyes, and wrote that she had first stumbled onto his activities almost by accident, reviewing paperwork Robert had asked her to help organize one evening, noticing inconsistencies between vehicle sales and cash deposits that made no sense for a business the size of the dealership. She had said nothing at first, assuming there was an innocent explanation, until a second and then a third document made the pattern impossible to ignore. She wrote that she confronted Victor directly, alone, believing naively that a private conversation might resolve her concerns quietly, and that his reaction in that moment had told her everything she needed to know about how far he was prepared to go to protect what he had built. Diane wrote that she had gone to the police once, quietly, and had been told there was little they could do without more evidence, and that shortly afterward her car had been run off the road late one night in what was reported as an accident, but which she knew, with certainty, was a message. She described that night in more detail than Karen expected. The sound of the other vehicle coming up too fast behind her on an empty road, the way it had forced her onto the shoulder and then simply pulled away into the dark without stopping, leaving her shaking behind the wheel with a clarity she had never felt before. She wrote that she understood, in that moment, that this was no longer a warning she could afford to test twice. She made the decision within days. She would disappear entirely, cut every possible thread connecting her to her old life, and trust that a clean, total absence would keep her husband and daughter safe from a danger that only she could see clearly. She wrote about the practical horror of that decision in ways Karen had never considered, the terror of leaving without saying goodbye, of knowing her daughter would wake up one morning and simply find her gone, of choosing a version of protection that would look, to everyone who loved her, exactly like abandonment. She wrote that she had followed the story of the investigation from a distance for years afterward, that the business partner had eventually been convicted on unrelated charges nearly a decade later, and that by the time it might have been safe to return, she no longer knew how to explain 30 years of silence to a daughter who likely believed she had simply been left behind. Diane also wrote about the earliest years of her disappearance in painful, specific detail, describing the months spent moving between small towns before finally settling in Millbrook, working odd jobs under a name she'd built for herself from a distant relative's paperwork, terrified every time a stranger looked at her a moment too long that she had been recognized. She wrote about lying awake, convinced she had heard Robert's voice outside her window on more than one occasion in those early years, though she knew rationally it could not have been true, a mind endlessly replaying the life it had been forced to leave behind. She wrote that the fear had eventually dulled into something quieter and more permanent, not gone, but manageable, the way a person learns to live around an old injury rather than heal from it completely. Karen read the letter twice through tears that came so suddenly she barely felt them start, and somewhere in the second reading the anger she expected to feel simply did not arrive the way she had always assumed it would. What she felt instead was something closer to grief layered on top of grief, mourning not just the mother she had lost as a child, but the entire life that mother had been forced to live alone, in a small rented house in a town called Millbrook, working quietly under a borrowed name, waiting for a danger to pass that had already passed years before she found the courage or the certainty to believe it. Diane had spent 3 decades protecting a daughter who had spent those same 3 decades believing she had been left behind, and both of them, in their own way, had been telling themselves a story that was only half true. The letter ended with a final line that Karen would return to again and again in the months that followed, a line that read simply that not one day had passed in 30 years when Diane had not thought of her daughter and wondered who she had grown up to become. Karen sat with that sentence for a long time before she finally folded the letter and went to wake her daughter, because some truths are too large to carry alone even for a single night, and because Megan deserved to hear, directly from her mother, the real story of the grandmother she had only ever known as an absence at the edge of family conversations. They sat together at the kitchen table until nearly dawn, Karen reading the letter aloud a third time, and somewhere in that reading the silence that had defined their family for 30 years finally began, slowly, to break apart. If this story is holding you the way it held Karen that night, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, because we tell stories exactly like this one every week, true accounts of hidden truths and the moments that finally bring them into the light. In the days that followed, Karen decided she needed to understand the other half of the story, the part her mother's letter could only describe from a distance. So she reached out to the Dayton Police Department to ask whether any records still existed from an investigation involving her father's old business partner. After being redirected twice, she eventually reached a retired detective named Harold Briggs, who had worked white-collar cases in the department decades earlier and remembered the general shape of the case immediately, though the specifics had faded with time. He confirmed that Victor Kessler, the man Diane had named only by his first name in her letter, had indeed been investigated and eventually convicted years later, not for the money laundering scheme Diane had stumbled onto, but for an unrelated fraud charge that had finally caught up with him after a long career of narrowly avoiding consequences. Karen also spent an afternoon with the Millbrook County Clerk's office, curious how a woman with no prior documented history had managed to build an entire legal identity from nothing 30 years earlier. The clerk explained, somewhat apologetically, that in the years before digital record-keeping became standard, it was far easier than most people realized for someone determined enough to establish a new identity using the paperwork of a deceased relative or a distant, disconnected branch of family. Filing for a replacement Social Security card and a driver's license using documents that raised no red flags in a system that simply wasn't built to catch that kind of quiet reinvention. It wasn't glamorous or elaborate, the clerk said, just patient and careful. Exactly the kind of quiet persistence Karen now understood her mother had built her entire second life upon. That detail settled something for Karen that had nagged at her since the beginning. The question of how her mother, a woman with no criminal background and no experience in that kind of world, could have possibly known how to disappear so completely. The answer, it turned out, was less about expertise and more about sheer necessity. A woman who had never once in her life imagined needing to vanish, teaching herself in a matter of weeks how to do exactly that, driven by nothing but the conviction that her daughter's safety depended on it. Karen found herself thinking, more than once, about the quiet, invisible courage that must have taken, a kind of bravery that never once looked like bravery from the outside, because no one was ever meant to see it happening at all. Briggs told Karen something that chilled her, that Kessler had a documented history of intimidating witnesses and business associates who threatened to expose him, though nothing had ever been proven strongly enough to bring separate charges. He said that in hindsight, knowing what Karen had just shared with him, her mother's account fit a pattern the department had seen from Kessler more than once, a pattern of quiet threats and staged accidents that never quite crossed the line into evidence a prosecutor could use. Briggs admitted, with visible discomfort, that if Diane had come to them with more support at the time, the department might have taken her concerns further, and that learning now what she had sacrificed to protect her family left him with a heavier conscience than he expected a 30-year-old case to still carry. Karen also learned from Briggs that Kessler had died several years earlier, quietly, of natural causes, having served a relatively short sentence and lived out his remaining years largely unnoticed. There would be no confrontation, no courtroom reckoning, no moment of justice delivered in the way true crime stories often promise. There was only the fact of what he had cost her mother, unanswered and permanent, a debt that would never be collected from the man who had created it. Karen found this, in its own way, harder to accept than almost anything else she had learned. The sheer ordinariness of how a man who had shattered her family simply lived, aged, and died without ever facing what he had truly done. In the weeks that followed, Karen returned to Millbrook to see the small rented house where her mother had spent 3 decades of a life Karen had never known existed, to speak with the handful of neighbors and coworkers who had known Eleanor Marsh without ever knowing she was hiding an entire other life beneath that name. The neighbor who had known her longest, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Calloway, invited Karen in for coffee and spoke about Eleanor with a warmth that surprised her, describing a woman who brought soup when Ruth was sick, who never missed a chance to help a neighbor's child with a school project, who nonetheless kept a wall around herself that no one in 20 years had ever managed to fully get past. Ruth admitted she had always sensed there was a story Eleanor was protecting, though she had long ago stopped trying to guess what it might be. Karen also spoke with a younger neighbor, a woman named Priya Nair who had moved in next door only 6 years earlier and had grown close to Eleanor despite the age gap between them, treating her almost like a surrogate grandmother. Priya wept when Karen explained who Eleanor had really been, saying that Eleanor had once told her, during a quiet evening on the porch, that she had a daughter somewhere she loved more than anything in the world but could never see again, and that she hoped, someday, her daughter would understand why. Priya said she had never pressed for details, assuming it was simply too painful a subject to revisit, and that she now carried a strange, aching comfort in knowing Eleanor's hope had finally, somehow, come true. Karen learned small details that ached in ways she hadn't expected, that Eleanor kept a framed photograph of a young girl on her dresser that no one had ever asked about, that she always grew quiet and withdrawn on a date in October that meant nothing to anyone else in town, that she had, without explanation, donated to a children's charity in Dayton every single year for 30 consecutive years. The hardware supplier she had worked for confirmed she had never once taken a vacation day in over 2 decades of employment, and Karen understood, standing in that small office listening to a man describe her mother's work ethic, that Eleanor had built a life almost entirely without joy, a life constructed purely to survive rather than to be lived. Because living fully might have meant risking the safety she had sacrificed everything to protect. Karen also tracked down a former co-worker of Eleanor's from the hardware supplier, a man named Frank Dellinger, who had worked alongside her for nearly 15 years in the bookkeeping office. He remembered her as sharp, meticulous, and almost obsessively private about anything outside of work, but he recalled one detail that struck Karen deeply. Every October, without fail, Eleanor would ask for a single day off, the only day off she ever requested in 15 years, and she would never say where she went or why. Frank had always assumed it was a doctor's appointment or a family obligation she didn't care to discuss. Karen realized, sitting across from him, that October was the month her mother had disappeared, and understood that Eleanor had spent 3 decades privately marking an anniversary that no one around her ever knew the meaning of. Karen also found, tucked inside a small metal box in the back of a closet in the Millbrook house, a collection of newspaper clippings from Dayton papers spanning nearly 20 years, articles about school events, local sports, anything that might have mentioned Karen by name as she grew up. There was a clipping from Karen's high school graduation, a small photo from a local paper's coverage of the ceremony, worn soft at the edges from being handled so many times. There was another from years later, a brief mention of Karen's name in a community newsletter about a charity run she had once participated in. Diane had been watching from a distance the entire time, piecing together her daughter's life through whatever fragments a stranger's discretion allowed her to find, never able to reach out, never able to explain why she couldn't. These were not the actions of a woman who had walked away without looking back. They were the quiet, careful gestures of a woman who had never once stopped being a mother, even when she could no longer be present as one. Karen walked through the small rented house one final time before it was cleared for the estate sale, running her hand along a kitchen counter her mother had touched every day for 30 years, standing in a bedroom that held a life Karen would never fully understand, and found herself grateful, in a way she hadn't expected, that at least now she finally knew. The DNA results arrived by email nearly 3 weeks after Karen submitted her sample, and she asked Megan to sit beside her before she opened it, unable to face the confirmation alone, even though she no longer had any real doubt about what it would say. The report used clinical, bloodless language to describe what Karen already knew in every part of herself that mattered, confirming a parent-child biological relationship with a probability so close to certainty that the report listed no meaningful margin for error at all. Seeing it written in that flat, scientific language somehow made the truth land differently than the letter or the scar or the handwriting ever had. An absolute, unarguable fact laid out in percentages, closing a question that had technically remained open, however faintly, for 30 years. Karen did not find peace easily, and she would tell you herself that some part of the grief never fully closes, that there is no version of this story where 30 stolen years are simply given back. But she found something else in its place, a kind of understanding that reshaped every memory of her childhood into something less painful than abandonment, and more honest than the silence her family had lived inside for so long. She began speaking with her father, gently, about what she had learned, and though the conversations were difficult, they were the first honest words about Diane that had passed between them in 30 years. Robert wept when Karen finally showed him the letter, and admitted, for the first time in 3 decades, that he had always privately believed Diane would never have left them by choice. Though he had buried that belief so deeply, he had almost convinced himself otherwise. He told Karen, haltingly, about a conversation he'd had with Diane only weeks before she vanished, one he had never repeated to anyone, in which she had seemed distracted and afraid in a way that was unlike her, and had asked him strange questions about whether he trusted his business partner completely. At the time, he had dismissed it as stress. In the years afterward, he told Karen that memory had quietly haunted him, a detail he could never quite explain away no matter how hard he tried. And reading Diane's letter finally gave that old unease a shape he could understand. He also confessed that in the first year after Diane disappeared, he had hired a private investigator on his own, without telling anyone, and that the man had turned up nothing beyond a vague lead in a town he could never verify, a lead Robert had eventually written off as a dead end and never mentioned again. Sitting with Karen now, he realized with a quiet, aching regret that the lead had very likely pointed toward Millbrook all along, and that if he had pushed harder or trusted his instincts instead of his fear, he might have found Diane decades earlier. Karen told him gently that there was no way to know that for certain, and that Diane herself had chosen the silence as the only path she believed was safe. But she could see the weight of that unanswered question settle over her father regardless. One more piece of a story that had taken 30 years to fully come into view. Karen kept the letter in a drawer beside her bed, and on the anniversary of the day her mother disappeared, she now visits the small house in Millbrook where a stranger named Eleanor Marsh once lived a life built entirely out of love for a daughter she was never able to hold again. She brings flowers to a small marker there now, and sometimes brings Megan with her, so that the story of Diane Ellison is no longer a silence passed down between generations, but a truth spoken openly, carried forward instead of buried. Megan, for her part, has started asking questions about her grandmother that no one in the family ever had answers to before, and Karen finds a quiet comfort in being able, finally, to give her real ones. She has begun writing down everything she has learned, not for any particular purpose beyond making sure the story is never lost again the way it was lost for 30 years, filling a notebook with details she once would have had no way of knowing. The sound of her mother's laugh, the small rituals of a life built in hiding, the quiet love that persisted through every one of those hidden years. Karen has also started, in small ways, encouraging her father to speak more openly about the years he spent alone, raising her without ever fully understanding why his wife had left, and she has watched him soften in ways she didn't expect. No longer carrying the story as a private shame, he assumed reflected some failure of his own. There is a particular kind of relief, Karen has said, in watching someone finally set down a weight they had carried silently for so long they had almost forgotten it was there, and in knowing that the truth, however painful, had ultimately given her father something he had quietly needed for 30 years, permission to grieve a wife who had never actually stopped loving him, rather than a wife who had simply walked away. On their most recent visit, Karen and Megan sat together on the small back porch of the Millbrook house. The same porch where Priya had once shared quiet evenings with a woman she believed to be simply a private, kind neighbor. And Karen found herself telling Megan stories she hadn't thought about in decades. Small, ordinary memories from childhood that had nothing to do with the disappearance at all. The sound of her mother humming while she cooked. The specific way she used to braid Karen's hair before school. For years, those memories had felt too painful to revisit, tangled up as they were with the loss that followed. Now, for the first time, Karen found she could hold them simply as what they were, good memories of a mother who had loved her completely, without the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on every one of them. Karen's story is a reminder that the people we lose are not always lost the way we assume, that silence can sometimes be its own form of protection, and that the truth, however long it takes to surface, has a way of finding the people who need it most. It is a reminder, too, that the family stories we accept as children, the ones we never think to question because no one around us ever questioned them either, can hold entire hidden chapters we spend a lifetime never suspecting, chapters that only come to light through the smallest, most unlikely accidents, a wrong turn into the wrong room on an ordinary afternoon. Somewhere in a quiet corner of Ohio, a mother's love outlasted 30 years of separation, a borrowed name, and a danger she faced entirely alone, and in the end, it was enough to finally bring her daughter home to the truth. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more true stories like it, and share in the comments if a hidden family truth has ever reshaped how you saw someone you loved.